today from different time zones for the Iraq hearing of the International People's Tribunal on U.S. Imperialism, Sanctions, Blockades, and Coercive Economic Measures. As you know, the tribunal has been gathering in sessions after work that has spanned years to hear the testimony, the expert and direct testimony of witnesses from countries around the world who have been subjected to the ravages of US imperialism, particularly taking the form of sanctions, blockades, and coercive economic measures, both as a weapon of war, but also as a mechanism of value transfer from peoples and nations around the world to the United States and the broader imperial core. The case of Iraq is perhaps one of the best known and most chilling cases of the use of sanctions, blockades, and coercive economic measures to do everything possible to destroy a nation and a people, working hand in hand with military assaults, the use of internationally banned weaponry, and illegal colonial wars and decades-long occupations targeting the nation and people of Iraq. We are very grateful to our witnesses today who will discuss the situation of Iraq and its battle against US blockade sanctions and coercive economic measures, both historically and at present. The testimonies that we are going to hear today are central to this tribunal's project of creating a record, but also leading to practical action, litigation, and implementation of meaningful measures to hold the United States accountable and its partners accountable for their ongoing crimes against the people of Iraq and the people of the world. To learn more about the activities of the tribunal, please visit our website at sanctionstribunal.org, where you can sign up for the forthcoming hearings which are taking place, as well as watch the videos of previous hearings that have taken place. After the session is completed, the video will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. And at our YouTube channel, you can watch also all of our previous video sessions, as well as clips from our opening and other past sessions as well. And we encourage you to share the recording of this hearing with others to provide more information, background, and information in the battle to hold US imperialism accountable for its crimes in Iraq and internationally. My name is Charlotte Cates. I'm one of the members of the steering committee of the tribunal. I'm also the international coordinator of Sami-Dun Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network, and I work with the National Lawyers Guild and the International Association of Democratic Lawyers. The steering committee of the tribunal is comprised of a range of organizations, lawyers, scholars, and activists who are working on various levels to hold US imperialism accountable for its ongoing crimes. I'm going to be turning over this hearing after this introduction to Matteo Capasso. And just to give a little introduction to him before we actually move on, Matteo Capasso, who is one of the rapporteurs for the International People's Tribunal and a member of its steering committee, is also the Marie Curie Research Fellow between Columbia University in New York and the University of Venice, Italy, and his work focuses on the impact of US imperialism on the Global South. Today, we're going to be hearing from 3 witnesses who will be presenting direct and expert testimony about US sanctions, blockades, coercive economic measures, and the overall impact of US imperialism on Iraq. First today, we're going to be hearing from Professor Suheir Ibrahim Hachim, who is an assistant professor of environmental international law at the College of Law at the University of Anbar in Ramadi, Iraq. He's a holder of a PhD in environmental international law and sustainable development achieved at Lebanon University in 2013. After we hear from Dr. Suheir, we'll be hearing from Professor Raed Hassan from the Wasil Southern District of Iraq. He studied private law, taught in one of the Iraqi universities, and is currently a doctoral student. After we hear from Professor Raed Hassan, we will hear from Dr. Dena al-Adeeb, an Iraqi-born feminist scholar, activist, artist, cultural worker, educator, and mother, working at the intersection of US imperial war geographies, militarism, and racial capitalism as they manifest through collective memory, heteroculture, material and visual culture in the Middle East region. Al-Adeeb scholarship takes the ongoing war on terror and the US military invasion of Iraq as a site from which to explore questions of gender violence, neocolonialism, race and ethnicity, extractive capitalist economies, and militarism in comparative and transnational perspectives. She is currently working on her book manuscript entitled The Architecture of War, the US Destruction of Iraq, Heterocultural Imaginaries, and Collective Memory in the Persian Gulf region. Following the testimonies of our three witnesses, we will turn to our jurors for questions and further discussion. The jurors who are with us today are Mohammed Tai, Marjorie Cohn, and Eva Nanopoulos. You can find their bios in full at the website of the International People's Tribunal at sanctionstribunal.org. Before we begin, I would just like to make one further housekeeping note. Testimony and discussion at this session will take place in both English and Arabic. There is an interpretation function that is available on Zoom. To use the interpretation function on Zoom on your computer, please click on the globe at the bottom of your Zoom screen, which has the word interpretation underneath of it, and choose the language English or Arabic, whichever language that you need. If you are bilingual, you can keep it on original audio and you will hear people speaking in both English and Arabic. If you're using a mobile phone to access the session, please click on the three dots where you can change settings. Click on Interpretation and choose either English or Arabic. After you select your language, click on Done at the top right of your phone screen in order to ensure that that your selection is saved. Thank you once again to all of you for joining us today, and thank you to our witnesses for being part of this process of a collective movement of popular accountability on the legal, political, and internationalist levels for US imperialism, for its ongoing crimes, the horrors that have been inflicted on Iraq, from the notorious Madeleine Albright quote that the taking of lives of millions of Iraqi children was worth the price, was worth the cost of destabilizing the country, to the current reality of Iraq working to rebuild after occupation. And just once again, before we begin, I'd like to note that we have an additional juror with us today, Edre Alalia, and welcome to Edre. I will be passing this over to Matteo, who will be chairing the rest of today's session. Thank you, Matteo, for this. And as we get started, I will turn to Dr. Suheir Ibrahim Hachim to present the first testimony of the day. Welcome, Dr. Suheir Ibrahim Hachim.
Peace be upon you. Thank you all for those who are organizers of the tribunal. I'm very happy to be part of this tribunal, and it's a great privilege, particularly to be in conglomeration with people who write and research sanctions. I will speak on two main issues, and this is the legal aspect and the humanitarian aspect, meaning the invasion. When we go back to the history and the legality of the invasion, we have to start from the invasion of the Iraq, and particularly the legal text and the first act. And in 1990, the law 66, which condemned the invasion of Iraq of Kuwait. In 1990, another law, 6061, and that means that another law that allowed the justification for the sanctions on Iraq, which led to the death of many of old people, children, and women. and then also impoverish the population, that there is no more food. And then there's the law of 678, and legitimize the use of all the previous laws, in addition to this particular law is the imposing of the imposition of peace in Iraq. So not only is it just sanctions, but also an imposition of changes within the Iraq and the promotion of peace by use of all means necessary to promote peace in Iraq, but also international peace. This particular text, they allowed the invasion of Iraq through this use of particular article. After that law, another law of 1441, which imposed sanctions on the oil sector and also a lot of minerals, and then imposed sanctions also on the travels of Iraqis abroad. And so this is a complete violation of the freedom of movement for people. If we stop at this point, the legality of the intervention in Iraq is derived from 687 article. So now all means became legal in the sense of bombs, but also different forms of sanctions to stabilize Iraq from their view. If we go back to Camp David, we noticed that there are a lot of similarities of the imposition of peace in the region, that they have the right to intervene. So the invasion of Iraq by the United States on the 20th of March, 2003, with the leadership of the United States and Britain. And it was a complete invasion by troops on the ground, but also by air. And there was an Iraqi saying, which states that the one who see are not the same as those who listen. And so, and I say from my own experience, there was just a fire lit up in the skies, and the number of victims were millions. The hospitals were destroyed, families were obliterated. There's no electricity, there's no water, there's no bridges. The road is there. Why are they bombing the roads and the routes between one city to another city? All of the lines that connected the cities to one another, they destroyed them intentionally. And so this is one of the results of the invasion. And despite all of that, our investigative process continued to seek the truth behind the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and they established a committee in 2003. And you all heard that recently they talked about also what happened with the UN ambassador of Syria. The United Nations to Syria, sorry, and they talked about the research for weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons in the region. There was no law or any findings that show that there was actual weapons of mass destruction in the United Nations. And so, despite the fact that they spend so much money into finding weapons of mass destruction or anything like that, there are no findings that show that they haven't found any. So, and this is the idea that they try to keep Iraq under the auspices and the control of the United States, because they are not trying to reach a conclusion to that question of weapons of mass destruction. And so all of our assets are continued to be sanctioned and controlled for up to next 60 years. So the invasion of the Iraq should be seen through the following 2 points. And that's the destruction of the Iraqi army, which they have succeeded in. And the second one is the destruction of the Iraqi human being. Any city across the world, be it small or big, could come with its own equipment, massive, destroy it completely in 1 year or 2 years, and then it can develop it and build it again. But then to build a human being, you need decades. And so when we talk from 1990 until 2003, there were the sanctions that really destroyed the Iraqis, but then there was still remnants of the Iraqi human being. But after 2003, the Iraqi human being was completely destroyed. And so we're talking about 90s, 2000s, and then the 2010s, and now we're into the fourth, decade of brainwashing, of sanctions, and of an invasion. So how can we fix the Iraqi human being? So now we need a number of decades to rebuild the Iraqi human being. And then obviously now we have corruption, especially in the executive, judiciary, and branches of the government. There's infested a massive amount of corruption. So there has been a single a government in Iraq that did not seek its own personal benefit as opposed to the collective benefit of Iraq. Every government that came in power only sought its own benefit as individuals as opposed to the whole Iraqi. So before in the law, before 2003, we had the crime of bribery was execution in Iraq. But right now, so we used to have a strong law. If one commits a bribe and works for the government, that's a death penalty for that person. But now they removed it. And so now we live in an era of reproductive chaos, or chaos producing another chaos. So So the US Army privatized everything and allowed a capital to be stolen and appropriated by any international or even local entity, not national ones. So we had a complete medicine sanctions, we had sanctions over development over everything. And so this has led continuing to the deterioration of the Iraqi human being. So the whole nation right now, even education, they have infiltrated it. And so the legal sector of the country right now is corrupted. So now bribery and corruption are infested in every single sector across the country, and they have exacerbated since the invasion. And all of this has entered Iraq, has brought Iraq into a sectarian battle that is exacerbated by the corruption. So the question that we have is that how can we develop a human being under these conditions? So there is a need for a new society to form, but that will take time. And that takes more than 25 years, 25 to 50 years to get a new whole generation. And so now there is a necessity that to understand that the Iraqi people are destroyed. And as a professor at as a professor at the Iraqi University, to see my students to see that our laws they don't see the connection between the laws that we teach and also how our politicians are implementing them. So right now the whole society is destroyed. So I feel saddened to see that the whole destruction of the Iraqi society all of this destruction is caused by the invasion. The destruction of the Iraqi society is exacerbated by this invasion of the United States. And so now we, as a society, we are thinking about just, do we have water? Do we have electricity? Do we have the basic necessities to survive? As opposed to developing our own country. And it's all because of this invasion that happened. What exists right now is that we have people in power who buy their positions in power, and they stole the oil money, and we have no infrastructure. There is no industrialization. From the south to the north, there is no development whatsoever. Even cheese and milk. Now we imported from Kuwait, from Iran and Turkey, the vegetables, despite the fact that we used to have massive water, but right now it's all drought up because there is no preservation of the natural resources. We started importing fruits. And so right now, even we started negotiating of how could we deal with the water shortages in Iraq with our neighbors. In 2008, I was in Basra. Every 500 people, every 50 people, sorry, there's one case of cancer, and this is because of the bombings. Every 50 person, there is one case of cancer. And so this is very brief overview of the impact of sanctions and the invasion on the Iraqi people. And thank you very much for your time.
Dr. Suheir, thank you so much for your presentation. It was moving, it was important to hear your words and to hear how the sanctions and the invasion have really thrown Iraq into a situation of what you've called reproductive chaos. Our next expert witness is going to be Professor Raed Hassan, to which I'm going to leave the floor, though just 1 second, because it does not seem to be online at the moment. Professor Raed, can you hear us? Okay, so please, you can start the presentation whenever you want.
Greetings, everyone. Greetings, everyone. First of all, I want to extend my gratitude for everyone who's attending this session. I want to speak about the invasion of the U.S. troops. U.S. troops, they entered Iraq 20th of March 2003, and it was through air, through land. Which led to a lot of problems for the southern districts. Because of the invasion by the United States, a lot of the things that we experienced in the southern district is desertification and the loss of the green cover, and that resulted in the deterioration of industrial and agricultural productivity of the region. On an environmental aspect, this was catastrophic. Starting from 2003 until now, where we noticed that the environment is deteriorating day by day. And that has exacerbated since the invasion of the United States, by the United States of Iraq. Because of the toxic smokes that have been produced by the invasion in those districts, in the southern districts, have had an impact on wheat and corn and sugarcane and other food crops. And that led also to the pollution of the water and also the pollution of the water for irrigation schemes. That's on the one side. The impact of wars was very felt on the factories, on the land and the labs in those regions. And so those are actually dysfunctional right now. Until our very day, they don't work. And so there's no operating labs or factories in the southern region. And that's because of the bombings of the US on those factories and labs. One of these labs and factories is, for example, wool factories and cement factories and asphalt and other mechanical factories and other electronic companies, and for also dairy factories in those districts were destroyed. In addition to the invasion has led to the burning of orange, of olives and date and other crops, summer crops and winter crops that we used to grow are completely destroyed and burned. And that also exacerbated to the air pollution of the southern districts. That led to massive unemployment in that region, and also made it very difficult for people to migrate, especially from the southern region, farmers that pushed them to seek refuge to or migrate to big cities, urban spaces, and find work there. As a consequence of all of that pollution and all of that invasion, a lot of the old people and extremely young people, they have died, and largely because of the pollution of potable water, drinkable water. So all of these details are just some minute examples of how the southern districts, how they have felt the US invasion and the impact on the Iraqis in that region. And thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to answer any further questions about that region and the impact. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Hassan, for your intervention and testimony. I am sure we will follow up with questions from our own jurors and from the audience. I am pleased now to move to the third expert witness, Dr. Dena al-Adeeb. Please, the floor is yours, Dena.
here and to be able to share both some of my academic research as well as my experiences as an Iraqi activist, organizer, and a scholar who's been going back and forth between the United States and Iraq for many years, and looking forward to sharing some of those both research as well as lived experiences with you. So I'll be reading parts, and then I will be speaking towards the end about more of the lived experiences. At the beginning, I'll be sharing more of my research in which focuses on the systematic destruction of Iraq by the United States and the targeting of infrastructure, cultural heritage, and collective memory. And I'll end, like I said, with experiences from, from my trips there during especially the 1990s and the sanctions periods. Okay? And please, if I go over, do give me, give me a beep. I think I have 15 minutes, correct? Okay. But if I do go over, please just.
Don't worry, go ahead.
Okay. As a response to the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990, President George W. Bush, in his address before a joint session of Congress on the State of the Union on September 11, 1990, presented a new world order. The 1991 First Gulf War enabled the US to unleash sweeping institutional and power restructuring, not only in Iraq, but the entire Middle East region. The Bush Doctrine pronounced a far-reaching paradigm for unilaterally targeting US interests in the Middle East by way of new military strategies. Accordingly, US military operations were finally established and dispatched from geostrategic bases in the Persian Gulf states. Commanding the coalition forces, the US launched the First Gulf War in Iraq, which set the stage for the ruthless devastation of Iraq and militarization of the region that were integral to securing geopolitical control, supplies of natural resources, and command of international economic trade relations. Over the next 13 years of brutal sanctions, the restructuring of space and community attributed to US militarization and blockades set the stage for the 2003 US invasion of Iraq. The US occupation was made possible through not only the sanctions, but also through warfare strategies that included causing comprehensive damage to the infrastructure and restructuring the Iraqi state and its institutions, including its security, architecture, and apparatus, actions that incited the civil war, as other colleagues have mentioned earlier in the presentations, in their presentations. Iraq was the new frontier to practice the science of war, enable the technological and military industrial complex to advance intelligence and surveillance capabilities. The violent invasion transpired into a long-term occupation that proved to be a profit-generating business venture, rendering any Iraqi city a target of conquest, domination, and consumption. Iraq's futile integration into the transnational neoliberal economy imposed by the US was premised on rebuilding the state, including key state institutions, through the prism of universal ideas of liberal democracy, individual liberty, private property rights, free markets, and trade. Failed post-war reconstruction efforts reconfigured sectarian political institutions, channeled public funds into private hands, and further devastated the ravaged country after the 13 years of brutal sanctions, leading to a protracted sectarian violence and ethnic cleansing project or campaign. The methodical obliteration of the built environment by the US military forces must be understood as a military strategy of war for reconstruction by dispossession. The systematic destruction gives way to reconstruction in the service of an imperial military infrastructure, such as the building of permanent military bases designed to secure geopolitical interests at the center of the struggle for world power. The US reconstruction of Iraq took place through hyper-militarization of urban space and ineffective security apparatus that restricted movement through checkpoints, blockade, blast walls, and barbed barriers, which by the way, are still present and continue to restrict movement. I was just there in January of this year and felt the militarization, as much as it was in 2003 when the invasion happened. I was there in 2004 and was there in January, and I noticed the continuation of that militarization. There wasn't any decrease, but rather it was very much fortified at this point. Post-invasion, there were approximately 110 US military bases established at points throughout Iraq. By the time authority was transferred to the central government in Baghdad, the US military had reduced the size of its footprint in Iraq. 14 enduring US military bases remained, indicating long-standing construction programs aimed at securing the US's long-term interests, including geopolitical control over the supply of oil, not only in Iraq, but in the region. The bases were organized around airfields to facilitate the tactical operations, redeployment of troops, refuel and resupply operations. The bases include the Green Zone, the famous Green Zone in Baghdad. There's many more I'm not going to mention because of time right now. I'm happy to talk about it in question and answer if people are interested. Besides the military bases operated for permanent deployment, the largest and most expensive US embassy complex in the world was constructed inside Baghdad's Green Zone and protected by heavy fortification. The massive embassy complex cost $750 million to build and has been under construction since 2004. It houses the US Embassy, 619 blast-resistant apartments, and other extravagant amenities such as swimming pools, tennis courts, recreation centers, shopping malls, etc. The destruction of infrastructure and cultural heritage in Iraq by the US-led military forces was a deliberate decision made in advance by the Pentagon, as we know, which also designated specific archaeological sites as US and coalition military bases. The US role in the infrastructural destruction of historical sites, heritage sites, and architectural monuments was both ideologically driven and proto-genocidal. It was utilized in order to target a culture of remembrance and manufacture a crisis of representation. The US invasion of Iraq involved the reconfiguration of space and the social fabric of society, leading to the breakdown of Iraq's unifying codes and symbols, some of which are linked to the state's imagined ancient past and cultural heritage. Accordingly, the symbolic and representational built landscape that provided a communal identity and effective sense of belonging were targeted. Thus, the primary aim was to inflict fear and collective trauma on a community, which in turn dehumanizes and subjugates its members in order to secure their eventual surrender. As a result, the US inhalation of Iraqi material culture, such as cultural heritage, museums, libraries, universities, was the setting for the spectacle of destruction and obliteration of collective memories, including Iraq's collective memory of its ancient past, of their ancient past. Many Iraqi scholars, including Dr. Zainab Bahrani, Nada Shabbout, Umran Musa, Dr. Donnie George, confirmed that the US military claim of collateral damage does not hold validity and asserts that the US government was informed in advance of its duty to safeguard Iraq's ancient heritage and given briefings and documentation of the historical, religious, cultural sites under its protection. In quotes, during preparation for the 2003 war in Iraq, US military planners identified 150 important archaeological sites to be avoided. US archaeologists responded with a list of 4,000 vital locations, a degree of duty of protection that the Pentagon rejected, despite international law demanding it. Thus, the US deliberately targeted the destruction of heritage sites in an effort to disfigure the past. The US military provided limited media access to the horrifying invasion of Iraq, yet the military granted media access to destruction of representational practices, photography, video, and film, to support production of racialized ignorance. These images act as a visual archive that evoke the past and the present, as well as support specific historical and contemporary representations of empire building, domination, and supremacy. The physical occupation and destruction of heritage sites reveal a deliberate pursuit of symbolic representation of power for the purpose of displaying control, producing ignorance, and inflicting psychological warfare. After the 2003 US invasion of Iraq, military bases were also erected over 7 archaeological sites throughout the country, producing irreversible destruction, including and Babylon, Cush, Samarra, and Ur. The 4,000-year-old ancient city of Babylon became the headquarters of South Central Command of the multinational forces. Camp Alpha, established on September 2nd, 2003, occupied 150 hectares, spanning the northern part of the ancient city wall and housed 2,000 soldiers. Military trenches, helicopter launching pads, parking lots were constructed, necessitating the transport of important gravel that was chemically treated and compacted, causing foundational damage to the ancient artifacts, monuments, including the iconic Ishtar Gate and city. Evidently, the military bases were strategically established vis-a-vis the legendary archaeological site as a performative spectacle of power. Babylon's mythological significance for the locals as well as globally was employed as a triumphal trope of American imperial domination. Heavy military tanks drove over the 2,600-year-old brick processional way of Babylon, damaging it beyond repair. U.S. tanks rolled through the ancient streets of Babylon, an act that had no military value but to declare conquest, Dr. Dena Bahrami asserts. It seems evident that the U.S. military occupation of ancient heritage sites such as Babylon was ideologically driven to achieve imperial representational expansion desires. The symbolic magnitude of U.S. Army occupying the foremost mythological site, considered one of the 7 wonders of the world, reinforces representation of its unrivaled power. The purging of Babylon was a mechanism of empire building enacted to exhibit the invader's imprint, imperial present onto the past, while simultaneously obliterating the collective memory of the occupied people. In this way, ignorance was produced. The ancient archaeological site was also used to station essential amenities for the troops, essential in quotes, for the ground troops such as Green Bean Coffee, Taco Bell, Burger King, Pizza Hut, a post exchange, among other commercial facilities. I'm going to skip because of running time. There's many examples that I'm sharing with you here, but I'm going to skip and move towards here. Those responsible for administering these U.S. policies also strategically facilitate the destruction of Iraq's modern art museum, the National Library and Archives, and the Library of Quran at the Ministry of Religion Endowment, in a systematic campaign to obliterate Iraq's national history and disfigure collective memory. Thus, the U.S. systematic destruction of cultural monuments and heritage sites in Iraq must be situated within the framework of psychological warfare and acts of iconism. The use of the past has taken on a material reality in a physical occupation of antiquity and can be read along the same theoretical lines as iconoclastic acts, again, Dr. Bahrani declares. In contrast to the media blackout of the US systematic destruction and negligence in Iraq, the demolition of cultural heritage sites by the Islamic State, ISIS, was met with media sensationalization, which resulted in international outrage, as it was interpreted as a direct act of iconism. Also, the obliteration of collective heritage by ISIS received more media attention, specifically in the US, than atrocities inflicted upon Iraqi bodies throughout the sanctions periods and the US invasion and occupation. What are the consequences of blasting images and videos on social media outlets and networks of the destruction of heritage sites by ISIS and not by the US, rather than of the millions of people affected by the mass violence and genocide? The asymmetrical production of ignorance by the media in relation to destruction perpetuated by ISIS versus the US leads us to ask, what are the factors that make one type of cultural destruction, iconism of figural images, seem horrendous and unacceptable, another, destruction of non-figural architectural, archaeological sites or standing monuments, more readily acceptable as part of collateral damage of war? I'm going to skip again because of time. I'm looking at time. Yeah, I'm going to conclude this part. The aforementioned examples indicate that the U.S. military strategically occupied ancient heritage sites and neglected its legal role to protect important cultural monuments. The only site that was protected by the military during the invasion occupation of Iraq was the Ministry of Oil. Meanwhile, the Museum of Archaeology was pillaged, and the National Library and Archives and the Library of Qur'ans and the Ministry of Religious Endowment were blazed. The occupying army made no attempt to safeguard any cultural and educational institutions, including the Iraqi National Museum, where thousands of objects were stolen from its galleries and have yet to be recovered. I think I have what, 6 more minutes? Something like that?
Yeah, sure, even 10 minutes if you want. Go ahead.
Really? Okay. Yeah, I'm just, okay. I'm gonna just skip through this. Okay, Ambassador Barbara Bowden, who represented the US at Baghdad during the US invasion, disclosed during an interview with Charles Ferguson in his documentary No End in Sight, which I recommend, that Washington gave direct orders to everyone involved not to intervene in the looting that happened right after the US invasion in 2003. On several occasions, I'll just conjecture. On several occasions, the personnel from other museums marched over to the US Armed Forces stationed near the museum and pleaded with them to intervene, appealing to them to direct their tank toward the museum and block the entranceway to deter the looters from entering and exiting. There's an estimate that over 17,000 artifacts were stolen during the invasion occupation of Iraq. The looters knew exactly. Dr. George Galloway, who was there during the specific acts and the specific incident, affirms that the looters knew exactly what they were looking for, were able to discern the difference between replicas and originals, and acquired the most valuable pieces. The looting took place over 3 consecutive days. The looting seems to have been pre-arranged by professional dealers for the international black market in stolen art. The thieves were aware of the exact location of valuable works and able to remove the artifacts skillfully using specialized tools. The extensive looting of ancient archaeological sites and cultural monuments is associated with the flourishing black market antiquities trade for international private collectors. The smuggling routes and networks which evidently were established during the first Gulf War of 1991 and developed over a 13-year period set the stage for the escalation of trafficking of artifacts after the 2003 invasion of Iraq. During the 1990s, the main, actually, I'm going to skip the exact locations of how these smuggling routes how they began and what roads they ended up taking. And I will move to more concluding, I guess. The US government should be held accountable for damage to Iraq's cultural heritage, infrastructural damage, and monumental destruction, particularly since looting and destruction of such sites are premeditated strategies of war that enable an empire to remap space as well as rewrite history in its own image. According to Haifa Zankana, a writer and an activist, she says, the deliberate destruction was not arbitrary or a byproduct of the US invasion occupation. Rather, it was a strategic goal to sabotage the history, civilization, and collective memory of the Iraqi people. The cultural war of destruction was a crime committed against the past, present, and future of Iraq and its people. End of quote. The devastation and dispossession inflicted onto the Iraqi landscape and its people who embody the deleterious effects of the invasion, destruction, occupation by the US continue to unfold 30 years later. I'm gonna stop here in relationship to sharing some of my research on the destruction, the infrastructural and monuments destruction, cultural heritage site destruction, and just share with you more kind of personal, I guess, experiences for a few minutes. I know I'm running out of time. This won't take too much. So I'm kind of, shifting gears here because I wanted to kind of give you kind of insight into the research, but I also want to definitely share some personal experiences. During the 1990s, I was living, so after the first Gulf War, I was not by choice relocated to the United States, and I was an anti-war organizer and definitely part of the building of an anti-war movement here that you eventually saw kind of come to public attention in 2003. But we started, we started this organizing in 1991 with the first Gulf War. So 13 years of movement building. And during that time period, I worked with many organizations here locally and nationally and internationally on different campaigns. And one of them was to raise funds during the sanction periods to take and be part of a mission, different missions that left the United States and went to Iraq during the sanctions to break the blockade, to publicly break the blockade, so there were basically different trips at different moments. And I'm going to share with you just one example that I remember specifically that really was moving. And I think it ties well to the quote that was shared at the beginning of this presentation about Madeleine Albright, in relationship to the price is worth it, when she was asked on public television, was the price worth it to invade Iraq, and that there were 500,000 children that died, and her response was, yes, the price is worth it. So this example I'm sharing is, makes me think of that example specifically. All right. So again, this is a personal experience. I was there in the spring of 1999. It was after months of organizing with, at the time, an organization called the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee that Ayad was part of, that now has become AROC, which was Arab Resource and Organizing Center in San Francisco. The name changed and it was reconfigured. So I'll be reading again, but this is a personal experience. In the spring of 1999, I spent a day at the Children's Leukemia Ward in a hospital in Baghdad, where I distributed medicine, toys, and money. There were medical consensus in Iraq that the impact of the Gulf War increased leukemia and incidents such as leukemia incidents as a direct result of the depleted uranium used by the US and British forces. The sanctions escalated this dire reality. As I walked along the rundown, dimly lit hospital corridors, I looked through the cracked glass window at the frail and, sorry, my text is skipping. As I walked along the rundown, dimly lit hospital corridors, I looked through the cracked glass window at the frail and failing bodies of children and witnessed the color of life fading from them. These were children, between, 1 to 9 years old, 10 years old, but the 10-year-olds look like they're 7-year-olds. Most of them very malnourished. They're very frail. It was a horrifying vision to see. 6 children lined up in rows on sheetless, tattered mattresses with nothing in the room except the bed and the tattered mattress. They looked up at their parents' sad eyes in utter hope of the slightest respite and consolation. Parents nursed their children as the short-staffed hospital devoured one by one. The angel of death hovered over them. These symbolic offerings that we went with paled against the threat of death that loomed around them. I retreated to the doctor's office and humbly performed the offerings. He accepted, but informed us that the best way to support is by offering the families funds so they may be able to visit their dying children. So some of them could not afford the trip all the way from northern or southern Iraq. So unfortunately, especially during the sanctions period, these parents who are from different cities around Iraq didn't even have enough money to take a bus trip to go visit their children. So a lot of these children were dying by themselves without even their parents there. And, and because they're short-staffed, some of the doctors and nurses weren't even there when these children died. It was really, really very horrific and moving. As a mother, seeing that was extremely painful. The doctor stressed that at this point, nothing could be done to save these children's lives, but to have their families around their last few days would be an important offering. He introduced me to a family that could not afford to come all the way from Kurdistan to see their child. The mother's weary and perplexed eyes still haunt me, and I recall Secretary of State Madeleine Albright's comments on the US sanctions against Iraq. Leslie Stahl asked her on 60 Minutes, "We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children that died in Hiroshima." This is a quote. "And do you know, is the price worth it?" Secretary of State Madeleine Albright responded, in quote, "I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it." 60 Minutes on, it was on, I think May 12, 96, this was said. I'm gonna just stop here. I can go on, but I think I'm out of time. Thank you all for your presence, your commitment, your solidarity, and your efforts in bringing something that has been silenced and needs to be finally addressed on.
Thank you so much, Dena, for your mixed testimony and expert witness on the impact of sanctions and in warfare of all kinds, from military to cultural one, that has been taking place on Iraq over the past decades. I would gladly open the floor to questions from the jurors so that we can have a lively conversation with our witnesses. And if there are no questions, I could start. But first and foremost, if any one of you, Eva, Rabat, yes, Eva, please go ahead.
Thank you very, very much, everyone, for your testimonies and for making the time. It's devastating, but also extremely important that we hear from you all directly. I have a few questions, but I'll start with only one for now, and perhaps it goes partly to Dena, but also perhaps to Professor Hachim, because they are quite linked. I mean, it's the same question, and you both mentioned it. I want, in your view, in what ways exactly did the sanctions facilitate the invasion? What, whether materially or ideologically, or in other words, or in other ways. So I'll be keen to hear a bit more on that. You both, I think, hinted at the fact that this was clearly your analysis, but thank you so much.
Marjorie, do you want to go with your question this way? Oh, okay. Dr. Suheir, go ahead. Tafadali, please.
The sanctions, the isolation, enabled and made it more easy for the complete invasion. So from 1990 until 2003, those are 13 years. So the Iraqi human being was destroyed. No medicine, no electricity, no water, no life. There was nothing. Humanitarian infrastructure did not exist at the time because of the harsh sanctions. I remember one of the sayings that an interview between an American journalist and Saddam Hussein. The American journalist, who said to the journalist that the Iraqi people will welcome the Americans with flowers, and Saddam Hussein said that that the Iraqi people will face you with bullets, because Saddam Hussein knew that those 13 years of sanctions it's a bitter experience, and they are willing to face the Americans with bullets, not with flowers. So they're willing to do everything to obliterate the sanctions and the isolations. So they added more salt to injury. They did not want the Americans because of the sanctions. But the whole invasion was well studied, well planned operation, as Dr. Dena mentioned. When the US Army entered Baghdad, it opened all of the markets and all the banks and stole everything. It was an orchestrated crime. And so the people who, and so they stole the money. But because of the starvation that the Iraqis had, they thought that the Americans came and opened the markets and opened the banks as a way to invite people to Baghdad and take their resources into their own hands. But these Iraqis are suffering. from before. So Iraq, they ended up stealing their own resources. So this is how the Americans, they manipulated things, is that they could not survive of the sanctions. And so when the Americans came there and opened the storages and warehouses of the food, they opened them to the civilians. And so the civilians, after 13 years of starvation, they came and saw the Americans that they opened these warehouses, and they could just take the food on their own. Notice that the well-orchestrated invasion, they stole everything that has to do with the Iraqi human being. So why did they steal the artifacts from Mosul? Mosul had two sections, the eastern and the western, and so there was a Dajla river. The new Mosul has the university and the developed city. Their life is none, but then the old Mosul is just a land that has nothing, because it had museums, mosques, centers of artifacts for many years that the state preserved. They did not leave a single thing behind, they just stole it. And so the civilization of Iraq was stolen. And Iraq's history is one of the oldest countries in the world, if not the oldest. So they deleted everything, to the extent that the Iraqi human being is becoming so weak that it just needs a savior. But then there's nobody to save the Iraq, and now we're completely destroyed a human being. And this is where we have reached right now, this low level of survival. Even your private rights, you cannot even garner unless if you pay, and through corruption. Thank you.
Dena.
To be an organizer during that sanctions period. And I remember we had packets. I wish I had them prepared to really get into specifics right now, which I'm happy to share with you maybe later. I could not find the document, but some of the things that I do remember, you have to realize these sanctions were one of the most severe sanctions placed on any country. And only after 5 years of severe sanctions, there was a program created. It was resolution, let me see if I can actually find it on me. So it was imposed obviously through UNSC. There was a resolution 5 years later to create an oil for food program, which basically, if I remember correctly, all oil revenues from Iraq go into escrow account.
النفط مقابل الغذاء والدواء.
نعم بالضبط. تريد تقول شيء عليه؟ تفضل
مقابل الغذاء والدواء.
تفضل اذا بدك تحكي شوي عليه وانا اكمل. تفضل. تريد تقول شيء عليه؟ تفضل دكتور.
This food for oil, this project was orchestrated and imposed by the United States, but it was orchestrated in the 90s, imposed in the 90s, but then it changed. And that's the idea that Iraq sells oil, all the money gets put in a federal bank in the United States. And so for it to buy Iraq, its food, America has to approve any purchase. So at times, some products that arrived were expired with low quality. The medicine in some of the markets, it actually reduced the
and we should add too that this issue of all oil revenues that go into this escrow account that is based in New York, as controlled by the United States, is still present to today. صح دكتور؟ تريد تقول شيء عن هذا الموضوع؟ إن شلون ليه هسه هذا فعال ليه هسه موجود؟ هذا البروجرام هو ما يسموه oil for food anymore, but it's still actually active. Is that correct?
نعم
Yeah, I'll continue by saying, some of the items on the list, first I want to say, yes, correct, that there were medicine that were expired, which was one of the main issues at the time. But I'll tell you some of the items I remember just from memory. Pencils were illegal for a period of time because the lead inside pencils were considered potentially dangerous because it could be used towards research and usage towards, weapons of mass destruction. So lead, I remember, was an issue. Baby formula for a period of time was also not allowed to be sent into Iraq because also, again, I don't remember the details. I can share with you the documents that specify what ingredients in baby formula can be extracted and possibly used towards the production of weapons of mass destruction. دكتور أو أي أحد يتذكر أي شيء ثاني من الليست هذه يعني يتذكر الأفلام الرصاص
any other sanctions such as lead, the milk formulas, anything else? There was a lab in the south.
I can think of, obviously, if there's a limitation on medical supplies being sent to Iraq, imagine, how many lives could have been saved if this medical equipment or medical or medicine was delivered on time and was not expired. There were many other examples, but these are the ones that I can think of without being ready at the moment. This is all I can think of.
Thanks, Dena.
If I may, I want to just add one more thing for a minute. As a witness, in 1992, to be precise, 93, sorry, French company they made an offer to Iraq, and that is to supply Iraq with all of the needs of medicine, food, and infrastructure, and all the necessities of life, in return for oil. But they don't take the oil right now. It doesn't take it in the price of the time. It takes it at a lower price. The Americans said no. So America did not even allow that. They didn't allow even for any agreement between French and the Iraqi. And I was there in Oman, and I was negotiating. The Americans rejected that. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva, for your question. Thank you for the great answers from Dena and Suheir. Marjorie, in order of those who are raised your hands, Marjorie, please. The floor is yours.
Yeah. Yes, 20 years after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, it's an outrage that no U.S. or British leaders have been brought to justice for their war crimes. Besides the oil for food program that Professor al-Adeeb mentioned, can someone talk about what some of the other worst sanctions were during that 13-year period? Thank you.
Should we take somehow more reflections by Dr. Tai and then we can answer? Okay, please.
I have some questions. A question to Dr. Suheir. You talked about something that doesn't open until after 60 years. Could you explain that again? That's one question. I have another question. Dr. Raed, you talked about a huge percentage and a huge number of issues. Do you have numbers, percentages? I wish if you could supply the hearing and the tribunal with specific numbers. As for the Dena al-Adeeb, who spoke about studies and statistics, please, if possible, you could supply the court, the hearing, with these artifacts. There is one aspect that wasn't spoken about, is that maybe we have read about in the newspapers. I don't know how accurate it is, but first of all, you spoke about on the torturing of the scientists, but also some reportings of killing of scientists. Did this actually happen, of the killing of scientists? What kind of scientists were killed? And then we read about torturing. Different forms of torturing, let alone in Abu Ghraib prison. Are these documented? Can we document these things? Can we prove them? If that's possible, we hope to supply the tribunal with these resources. And I want to also say that your testimonies were fantastic, magnificent, and well studied. And I thank you so much for your contributions. And thank you for the organizers of this tribunal as well.
Thank you, Mohammed, for your question. Thank you, Marjorie. Just to go through, Marjorie asked you about to provide other examples of sanctions that you were speaking about, and also and Dr. Tai to mention all the if you have more questions about more details about various aspects like numbers and statistics, torture of scientists, and so on. Dr. Mohammed, unfortunately, Professor Raed is not anymore connected, so we will ask him separately about your question. Please, Dr. Suheir and Dr. Dena, the floor is yours.
دكتور أنت أول وأنا أكمل وراك، تفضل.
شكرا جزيلا.
عفوا.
تكلمت عن القرارات اللي شكلت فيها لجنة تقصي الحقائق.
I spoke about the laws of the committee that investigated in the 1990s that searched for the weapons of mass destruction. They researched for 13 years for weapons of mass destruction. They didn't find them. For 13 years they have searched, and then 1441, which is a new law, gave the jurisdiction for the United States to enter any private or public and stop any Iraqi internationally or within national without the agreement of the Iraqi government, without the approval of the Iraqi government, to ask them questions about and investigate them about weapons of mass destruction. So in those 13 years, there was nothing to be found in weapons of mass destruction. So that's, I go back to the first square. There's no law that legitimizes, that allowed for the invasion of Iraq, which used the laws of 687 and 678, which imposes which allows the United States to impose its peace process across the region, and particularly Iraq. And so they created after that a new committee. And so I sent to our group message on WhatsApp that the Syrian ambassador to the United Nations, that they're talking about documents of that committee of the Iraq. They have the same, they have similar committee to the one investigative committee for the one that Syria experienced. And they have been searching for weapons of mass destruction in Iraq from 2003 to 2020. And they have tried to look for weapons of mass destruction, and they have pressured the Iraqi government for all of those years, 2003 to 2020, to pressure the government to allow it to search for weapons of mass destruction. And so there was this secret meeting that happened between the government and the Americans, and they said that they closed the file without disclosing of the results of this particular file. Are there weapons of mass destruction or there are no weapons of mass destruction? And they put in this box, and it's closed with a code that nobody knows it's the code to this box, and it's buried in the United Nations, and it's well secured, and nobody knows about this particular file of weapons of mass destruction. And this box will not be opened unless 60 years pass. This is what I spoke about.
sorry تفضل دكتور محمد ولا خلصت؟
Dr. Mohammed, you're mute. Yeah.
There are two more questions that were not answered, which is the killing of the scientists, which I don't know if it happened or not, and also the torturing. Maybe one of the friends of the tribunal could provide us with some evidence of the crimes committed by the United States. And what consequences did that have on the collective Iraqi people? And maybe we can, if we have evidence of that, we can provide it to the tribunal eventually. A lot of scientists of biology, physics, and they were assassinated. It was an orchestrated assassination. And it was a very political, and Iran had a big role in this. And they have assassinated a lot of the particular physicists who were experts in laser science and also physics and biology. And these two specialties that experience the most of assassinations and torturing. And there's in terms of torturing, there's endless evidence of tortured, and I'll do my best to bring witnesses of the torture, particularly those who experienced the torture in Blockades. But there's also sexual violence against, that doesn't even us as an Iraqi or a Muslim or Arab society in any way. So they dehumanized and humiliated the Iraqi person, and I can't personally speak about it right now here, but I will do my best to bring the evidence. And I know that the media spoke a lot about this, and it's all true, particularly what happened in Blockades prison. And I'll try to bring all the evidence to the tribunal.
May I say something? Do we have time? May I add? Can someone? I can't see anyone. So yes, Mateo, is that okay?
Yeah.
So I will also produce a list to respond to all these questions because they need to be comprehensively addressed, and it's hard to comprehensively address everything. So I'll definitely share documentation, but for the sake of this time, I will just share specific examples to shed light, but obviously there's many plethora, hundreds, if not thousands of examples I can share eventually. So I think one very moving incident that until today tortures me, and I've been working on a project on this, is an incident that happened in Muhammadiyah. It's also public. It was public. It's called the Muhammadiyah rape and killing. It was a gang rape and murder of a 14-year-old Iraqi girl called Abir Qasim Hamza al-Janabi, and the murder of her entire family. There was a base very close to her house, and 4 soldiers, can actually say their name. Here we go. 5 U.S. military soldiers of the 502nd Infantry Regiment were charged with rape and murder. Specialist Paul Cortez, Specialist James Barker, Private First Class Jess Spielman, Private First Class Brian Howard, and Stephen Dale Green. He was eventually discharged for mental disability. She was gang raped by all of them and murdered, and her family were also killed. They were actually, their whole house was set on fire. So other members of al-Janabi family murdered by American soldiers included her 34-year-old mother, Fakhriya Taha Mahsan, a 45-year-old father, Qasim Hamza Rahim, and 6-year-old sister, Hadil Qasim Hamza al-Janabi. The two remaining survivors of the family, the time they were 9 and 11, were at school during the massacre and orphaned, and many interviews have been made with them that are public and we can share. Some of the Abu Ghraib incidents that obviously have been made public, and there's plethora of information about them, but I'll share only a few examples again, just for the sake of this conversation. I think one that's very well known is the US Supreme Court decision, which included Hamdan versus Rumsfeld, have overturned Bush administration policy ruling that the Geneva Convention do apply to Abu Ghraib. So I think that's one that we can look at. Because at the time, maybe I should give some background, the George W. Bush administration at the time said that the abuses at Abu Ghraib were isolated incidents and not indicative of US policy. This was obviously disputed by humanitarian organizations, including the Red Cross, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. These organizations said that the abuses at Abu Ghraib were part of a wider pattern of torture and brutal treatment at American overseas detention centers, including those in Iraq, and they specify the different sites. This was not only in Abu Ghraib, there were many other sites in Iraq, and these all are documented that this was happening. Similar torture techniques and systematic abuse of soldiers in different sites in Iraq, including, of course, in Afghanistan. So this was not only in Iraq, but many sites in Iraq were also cited. Abu Ghraib just happens to be the one that got the most public attention. Let me see. In regards to, again, I can give more examples. I'm just using one example of each of the questions. So this is in regards to the Abu Ghraib question. In regards to, outside of a structural, institutional place that torture systematically happened. The example of the little girl I cited is important, and I think there's many other examples that happen outside of institutions like a prison, where it was just some a girl walking, for example, and that's the example I gave. But there's many others I can share. So a list in regards to the list of assassinations, academic assassinations. I can also give you a very comprehensive list, but for the sake of this time, I will give you only a few. In regards to professors, one that's very well known, Abdul Latif Ali al-Maya, assassinated under suspicious circumstances during the period of violence against Iraqi intellectuals and academics. Let's see. There's dates, for example, on April 10th, 2003, Abdul Majid al-Khou'i was assassinated. In November 1st, 2014, Hatem Kamel, Deputy Governor Baghdad government, was assassinated. March 2008, Paulus Faraj Raho, Chaldean Catholic Archbishop, was assassinated. On January 10th, 2020, Ahmed Abdul Samad, journalist, was assassinated. July 6, 2020, Hisham al-Hashimi, journalist. And you see this list, you see they're not only academics, there's our journalists, archbishops, government officials, Sunni and Shia clerks. And as you see, they're also very diverse in ethnicity and religious background. And again, the list goes on. I'm just sharing few for now. Again, for the question that was asked in regards to other than the Food for Oil program, again, there's many resolutions and many programs out there, but I think one that is notable for the sake of this conversation, and again, I will share the list, is the Development Fund for Iraq. So in, like we said, the Oil for Food program was developed during the sanctions period. Right after the sanctions period, this actually, that program in many ways transferred to something called Development for Iraq. So in May 2003, right, so a few months after the invasion, following the invasion of Iraq in March of that year, invasion happened in March, 2 months later in May, the Central Bank of Iraq Development Fund for Iraq account was created at the US Federal Reserve Bank of New York at the request of the Coalition Provisional Authority, CPA administrator. A part of the fund has been transferred to Baghdad in Iraq. And the DFI Baghdad account was opened at the Central Bank of Iraq for cash payment requirements. The fund also eventually received money from seized invested Iraqi bank accounts and funds seized by coalition forces. That was about $1.72.4 billion. 650 million of this amount belongs to Uday Saddam Hussein. Anyway, it gives on and on details. But the point here, what's key here is every single oil, oil revenues, basically it's the Central Bank of Iraqi, right, of Iraq. Everything has to be first placed in US Federal Reserve Bank in New York, and then transferred back to Iraq, right? So I think this is key. This is kind of what the Oil for Food program ended up moving into. So I think that's one to look, to look at as an example. And then another one is the, what is it called? Actually, this was an earlier one during the sanctions period. The United Nations Security Council Resolution 661, which was adopted on August 6, 1990. So right a few days after Iraq invaded Kuwait, reaffirming Resolution 660 and noting Iraq's refusal to comply with it and Kuwait's right of self-defense. The Council took steps to implement international sanctions on Iraq under chapter, I'm just skipping here. Okay, the Council therefore decided that the state should prevent, and this continued to happen for the next 13 years, the import of all products and commodities originating in Iraq or Kuwait at that time, later just stayed in Iraq, any activities by their nationals or in their territories that would promote the export of products originating in Iraq or Kuwait, as well as the transfer of funds to either country for the purpose of such activities. Obviously, Kuwait was taken out later, but keep the, the sale of weapons or the military equipment to Iraq and Kuwait, excluding humanitarian aid, which actually there are stipulations that's different. The availability of funds or the financial or economic resources to either country or to any commercial, industrial, or public utility operating within them, except for a medical or humanitarian purpose, which actually is not true. Also, there are, examples that didn't actually was not complied with. So these are just small examples. Like I said, I'm happy to be, to provide a more comprehensive list, but for now, I'm just giving, an example for each for the point of this discussion. I'm happy to provide more now if we have time.
Thanks, Dena. Thank you. I would pass the floor first to Prabhat and then to Eva, as there are more questions. Professor Prabhat and then Professor Eva.
Since Eva has to leave, maybe she should first ask her question.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, that's very nice. I don't feel I'm monopolizing the space now. I have two broad questions, and perhaps it's something we can continue to discuss later on with the witnesses. Two things. So the first, then I think you immediately began by situating the sanctions and the invasions within the sort of US project of a new world order, and I wonder if you can say a little bit more about that, and specifically, not only the military intervention, but how the sanctions fit into this kind of new ordering, how Iraq paves the way to something new. And relatedly, Professor Suheir as well, I was quite taken in response to my question. You spoke of an orchestrated crime. And it seems to me a little bit that the way we've been speaking about Iraq is that, there are moments, there's the Gulf moments, the military intervention then we all speak of the sanctions period, and then we speak of the invasion. And they appear as distinct moments. And I'm getting a sense increasingly from you very clearly that as it's an orchestrated crime, it's all together, and it's only changing narratives and changing techniques. And then you also spoke very nicely of sort of Iraq being not only a colonial laboratory, but really a science of war, things being developed. And we see, like, we have the technique of military intervention, then sanctions, then sort of invasion on spurious global terror grounds. So I wanted just to have a more clear, perhaps, confirmation of your side. Do you see the sanctions really as a breach between what in the international media try to be completely isolated instances, and there we see them as part of an orchestrated crime, to use the words that you both used? And thanks so much, because I think your testimonies help us understand really that we cannot see these moments as separate. They're just distinct aspects of a single reality. And how maybe you will capture that reality, I'm interested to know. Thank you so much again.
Thank you for that question. I think it's key and part and parcel, I think, of what we're trying to relay to you, that not only would we start from the first Gulf War, I would beg to actually, in my book, I go back to the British, actually, British colonialism, but and starts kind of there, and then talk about how during the transfer of world order from British colonialism and the failure of colonialism to the transfer of power to the United States, and how that transference of powers created this new world order. So I actually start all the way back there. But for the sake of this conversation and to stay kind of within this period of time, I would start even from the 1980 Iraq-Iran war. Right? So I'm not going to ask you to go back all the way to the British, because that's more of a history, kind of my chapter 1 actually begins that. I'm happy to do that if you want me to. But for the sake of this, if we're going to talk about kind of this period in time, I would definitely start this war from 1980. For Iraqis, they do not see this, like you said, as oh, the Iraq-Iran war separate. Oh, now we have the invasion of Kuwait and the first Gulf War, and then the sanctions, then the second Gulf War, then the Civil War. It's not seen that way. It is not experienced that way. It is experienced as one prolongated war that continues to systematically obliterates Iraq, Iraqi infrastructure, Iraqi institutions, Iraqi collective memory, Iraqi national identity, and create a space where then new logics are created. I'll come back to this in a second. So I just wanted to first, before getting into what all this means, wanted to set the stage of why start at the Iran-Iraq war. As you know, as Iraqis, we can talk more about this. Why do we see the beginning of this kind of continuous, this modern period, not the British, period, even though that is a continuation. But this period, I was 5 years old when the Iraq-Iran war started. I'm almost 50 now. The Iraq-Iran war was really understood as a geopolitical war between world orders, between the US and Russia. At the time, right before that period, Iraq was known as I'm sorry, I'm blanking. It was, let's say this, the largest and strongest communist party in the region was the Iraqi Communist Party, right before that period, right? So Iraq was definitely leaning towards, a Soviet in support of, the USSR. And the United States obviously was interested in moving that towards its court. And without getting into like deconstructing kind of the Cold War and how it played out in the region, Iraq definitely, we know, for example, the example of Afghanistan. I think a lot of people are aware of that, how Afghanistan became the battle space or battlescape for the war between the USSR and the US. Iraq is lesser known. That the Iraq-Iran war was exactly that example, right? And we know that the United States was selling weapons to Saddam Hussein and Iran at the same time, Khomeini. The Iran-Contra is a perfect example of that. When finally, this was one example, there's many examples, that's the only example that became public. But as Iraqis, we know many other examples where Iraq was, the US was, and not only with the US with the support of the Gulf countries, right? So with the support of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, all of the Gulf states basically in support, were supporting Saddam on so many different levels, right? And at the same time, when Iran became weaker, they started supporting Iran. So there was a balance of power, and the United States wanted systematically to destroy both countries' infrastructure to a point where then, which led actually, let me backtrack, sorry, which actually led to the invasion of Kuwait first. Why? For example, right before then, the main contestation, there were many contestations between Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi government and Kuwait. One of them was that Kuwait was obviously supporting financially Iraq during this period, while Iraq is fighting the war. One of the issues was Kuwait was slant drilling oil from Iraqi oil fields. So slant drilling is a technical term, which means the way oil is extracted from different places. When you slant drill, you basically go through the border and slant drill to be able to extract oil from the other border. So when supposedly the war ended, even though it didn't end, meaning like the military apparatus stopped, but the Cold War continued happening between Iran and Iraq, the Iraqi government asked Kuwait to stop slant drilling and pay back. And they didn't. There were many other issues happening there. And that's when, right a day or two before the invasion, Saddam Hussein met with, at the time, US Ambassador April Glaspie in Iraq, asking, if Iraq invades Kuwait, and at the time the Iraqi army was on the Kuwaiti borders miles away, asked if Iraq invades Kuwait, what would be the US response? And her official response was, the US will not intervene. This is a brother-to-brother issue, problem, conflict, and we have no interest in intervening. A few days later, Iraq invaded, and we know what happened. So I think it's important. I just want to situate why it's so important for us to start the war with the Iraq-Iran war and realize that the systematic destruction of Iraq and Iran started happening then, right? And that period led to the facilitation of the invasion of Kuwait. And from there, the sanctions started even before the first Gulf War. And I think that's very important to understand. So the understanding that sanctions were created not as, as a period in time where then when the invasion, the first Gulf War started, and after the United States wanted Iraq was, the war was ended, the sanctions continued. It did not stop. Right? So that's also evident of how systematically this was orchestrated, that Iraq needed to be destroyed, the infrastructure of Iraq, not because it's only about Iraq, as we were talking about earlier. It is a known fact, at least for regionally, that Iraq was the strongest Arab country in the region, right? And it had the strongest military infrastructure. It had the best educational system. It had the best medical system. And in the 60s and 50s and 60s, it was comparable to, there are studies that I can share, comparable to the medical level and educational level to Sweden. And there is actually studies done on this, which is, at the time was considered obviously a remarkable progression for Iraq. And you go from there to being now one of the worst educational systems, one of the worst medical systems, a destroyed infrastructure and so on. Within my lifetime, I saw that progression. I was born in the 70s. So I was part of that period where right before the Iraq-Iran happened, where I was part of that educational system that was excellent. I was part of that, had access to the medical system that was excellent, and saw the destruction, the systematic destruction of the country, right, over my lifetime. Anyways, I don't want to take too much time. I can go on, but I think it is key, and I'm so happy that you said that you know, and we can share more evidence on how this is systematic, this is orchestrated. And like I said, it's not only about Iraq, it's about the geopolitical of the region. It's about destroying Iraq as an Arab, semi-nationalist, semi-socialist state, and its relationship to the region, how it supported the Palestinian cause, how it supported, you know, I can go on and on. And I think, so it's about control, not only of Iraq, but also about geopolitically the region, but also in regards to geopolitically the larger region, meaning Asia and Africa, right? So, you know, for example, I'll give another example and I'll stop. I keep on saying I'll stop, but I think this is key, and I have a whole chapter on this. I think the United States was very much interested in creating a central command in the region, right? And the first Gulf War, the 1991 first Gulf War, provided the United States not only with a central command in the region, but had Qatar, the Gulf state Qatar, subsidized central command on its own land. So before that, the US was dreaming of getting a central command in the region. Here in 1981, there was a point where Gulf states were begging the United States to move in its territory and that they subsidized. So for example, central command, I don't know actually today what's happening, but until very recently was completely subsidized by the Qatar royal family. The military base, the whole military infrastructure. And you have to also understand what is central command in Qatar. This does not mean that's only in charge of US central command in Qatar. US central command in Qatar is not only in charge of what's happening in Iraq, because that's supposedly the premise that it was created. It was supposed to deal with the invasion of Kuwait. And after that, it was supposed to be dismembered or dismantled. It did not. It actually grew, as we know that history, right? And it was become central to the fight for against the US war on terror. So it no longer became an issue about securing the Gulf states' interests and the royal families in power and destroying Iraq. It became about, securing a world order, because we know every single missile that takes off from in the fight on the war on terror comes out of Qatar Central Command. So Central Command is in charge of the US war on terror trans-regionally, all the way to Afghanistan, to Pakistan, to Sudan, to Somalia, to Yemen, to Libya. So the Central Command is not only in charge of US war on terror in Africa and Asia, but also the waterways that transport this these oil tanks to the rest of the world. Actually, I can go on and on, but I think it's critical to understand Central Command was created in mind of this orchestration towards building something that's a new world order into the future, which now is successful. And what's interesting today, for the first time in this historical period in my lifetime, I think there's a shift right now with what's happening with with the new Arab summits. There's new geopolitics that are changing because we're seeing a shift towards creating alliances with China and Russia, and the US is now in a kind of in a shaky place. That's maybe a bit different than what we're trying to look at right now. But I think what I'm saying is there's these shifts are changing. These stories are, or these policies are shifting as we're speaking. We don't know what's going to happen, but I think the last at least 50 years, we know this has been the fact that this has been an orchestrated, systematic project that's about empire building towards not control of Iraq, not control of the region, but control of oil export import, oil control, oil resources, but also neoliberal policies around the region, changing a state like Iraq that had a quasi-socialist to now a hyper liberal economy. Right? The destruction of Syria is part of that. The destruction of Yemen is part of that. The destruction of Libya is part of that. The destruction of, what am I missing? Sudan, and obviously the sanctions against Iran is also part of that. Yeah, I'll stop here.
Dena, thank you so much, really, for this comprehensive answer to the question. I will let Prabhat speak, Dr. Mohammed first, and then I'll pass it to you, okay?
ممكن بس تعلي صوتك الله يخليك دكتور ما بدنا نسمع.
نعم ممكن إذا تفضلتي
if possible, could you name the name of the child who was raped, the area that she experienced that tragic incident, and if possible, the list of the scientists who were assassinated or tortured, Do you want me to send these names to you? Do you want me to repeat the name of the victim of rape, or do you want me to send this all complete list of information? The name of that child. As a tribunal, as we filed a lawsuit and create our report, we need to have all of these statistics and the names. Her name is Abir Qasim Hamza al-Janabi, and this is known as the Muhammadiyya rape and killing case. I'll find the exact name of the trial, if you give me a second. She wasn't just raped, but she was also eventually killed, and her house was burnt, and her family were burnt as well. The name of the trial is, what was her name? Her name is Abir Qasim Hamza al-Janabi, from the Muhammadiyya district.
Dr. Prabhat, please.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank both the speakers who are with us for the excellent presentations they have made. My question is the following. When the invasion of Iraq occurred, generally there was an impression all over the world, particularly in circles that study imperialism, that the US interest in Iraq arose because of its interest in oil. Now, the point is that, Dena gave this excellent testimony and so on, and she located US interests in a much wider geopolitical context. Now, what I would like to know is that how does oil fit into it, or does it not fit into it? I think one of the points she made is that substantial amounts of Iraqi oil revenue is deposited with the US Fed. Now, what I'd like to know is what has actually happened to the total Iraqi oil revenue. Iraq has one of the largest, oil reserves in the world. What has been happening to the Iraqi oil revenue compared to the pre-invasion period? How much of it is kept with the Fed? And again, Professor Suheir talked about the private looting of Iraqi oil revenues. How does that occur? What exactly is the arrangement within which the oil economy now functions, and to what extent it is beneficial to the United States?
دكتور تفضلوا وانا اقدر اكمل لان انا حكيت هوايه فتفضل او عصام او اي احد ثاني اذا يحب يحكي وبعدين انا اكمل.
Potentially somebody else could speak maybe, and then I could add because I spoke a lot.
نعم اسمعك واضح. أجيب. أنا لم أقل سمعت أنا لم أقل كان هناك نهب للأموال فترة الحصار.
I didn't say that during the sanctions that there was stealing of funds. There were just sanctions, and nobody could touch public money. After 2003, the orchestrated and well-studied stealing and theft, the Americans allowed it. So the US Army, US tanks, they opened the banks They opened the markets of the foods, and they opened all the safes, and the people, they would just take the money from the banks, from the foods. Before 2003, no human being would dare to open even any public warehouse or bank. And so I go back to the main reason for the destruction of the Iraqi human is because of the sanctions. For the 13 years, the Iraqi human being suffered of hunger, of sickness, of illnesses because of the sanctions. Extreme poverty. Even animals struggled with this because of the sanctions. Any human being who need, all human beings, they needed somebody to be, saved. They needed, they need to be saved. So they saw that as being saved. But even the wages. Imagine per month was $1 or $1.50. The carton of eggs is equivalent to 6,000 dinars, and the paycheck of one worker is 3,000. So eggs 6,000, paycheck is 3,000. All of the budget is controlled by the American government, and I can provide a report about this. And there are reports from the Central Bank of Iraq. Please, doctor, you have the space. I want to document that there's just so much theft and stealing during the invasion, but also after the invasion, under the auspices and the protection of the US troops. And that's why the behavior of the Iraqis and of its politics are completely destroyed. So the only thing that the Iraqis are now focused on is that just focusing on the Iraqi individual, and we're becoming a very individualistic society because of all this destruction. There's no more education, there's no more law, there's no cultural society. All of it was obliterated because of these sanctions. And also after the invasion. So even anybody born after 2003, they don't know about their history, about even the curriculum, they changed it. They deleted everything that had to do with the Iraqi history, with the Iraqi society and heritage. They deleted all of that. So, and I'm speaking about the development of the Iraqi human being. We're living, but we're surviving, but not living at this time.
If I may add to that, I think what Dr. Suheir is saying is critical to this discussion. So in my book, what I call this process, it's a long title and a term, but basically it's the re-engineering of the social fabric of society and collective memory and imaginaries. So, like I said, it's a very lengthy discussion, but the point is, that I'm agreeing with here with Dr. Suheir is the Iraqi psyche, Iraqi national identity, collective memory, and imaginary has been transformed, say, from the 40s, from somewhere between the 40s, 50s, 60s onward, from one that was committed to a specific national project, committed to a semi-socialist project, to one now that's completely devoid of any interest to a state, to an institution, and one that's really interested in a very hyper-capitalist market. You go from everyone's dream now is to go to the Gulf, for example. The Gulf has become this new model. So where in the 40s and 50s, and this is not only for Iraq, but for the entire region, where there was an interest and there was a project that was bringing all these states together, whether it's an Arab nationalist project or a quasi-socialist project or a third worldist project, you know, and unifying these states. You now have a very disfragmented region, a very disfragmented society in Iraq. You know, we saw that with what happened after the invasion and the you know, civil war that ensued. And we are now at a place where, you know, the average person is not interested in a project like that. They're interested in an individual, on an individual level, how to leave Iraq and go, for example, to the Gulf states. That became kind of the new model to emulate, a hyper neoliberal project that is very much interested in being part of this world market, right? Sorry, I'm having a hard time. Do you hear me? It feels like I don't hear myself anymore. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. So I think, yeah, so I think it's important to again, to reiterate, this is not a project just about oil. This is not just about access to the oil revenues in Iraq. And like I said, all the oil revenues are part of the, you know, the Development Fund for Iraq, which all goes from the central bank. It goes to, sorry, the US Federal Reserve Bank in New York. And then the money is redirected back to the central bank of Iraq. So, you know, so yes, it is about oil revenues. Yes, it is about the control of that, but it's way beyond. It's a far-reaching project about hegemony, and not just hegemony of the political economic, but really about reconstructing identities, reconstructed societies, you know, and moving it away from what I said of the past to a project that's interested in a neoliberal market and really kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Internalizing, you know, neoliberal democracy, right? Free market, free trade, privatization, and this is what we're seeing in Iraq. Institutions. So, you know, an example. Let me talk about an example, like a personal example. You know, we had my grandparents who were born in, like, you know, let's say, you know, 1910, right? They did not know how to read or write, right? From that generation to my dad's generation, one generation, right? My dad was born in 1940. His generation, and he's not the only one. He got a full scholarship after he finished engineering school, all free by the Iraqi government at the time, right? And my grandparents were illiterate people, illiterate, did not know how to read or write. They could not sign. My dad's generation, he went to Baghdad University, engineering, all paid by the government, got a scholarship to do a master's in the United States and a PhD. He got his master's at Stanford University in California, the best university in the world. He got his PhD in Colorado, right? Now, of course, what happened afterwards is a whole different issue. When he came back, there were problems, blah, blah. This is when I was talking about the beginning of the Iraq-Iran war and the kind of the destruction. I was forced to leave, but my cousins who, and now have a PhD and all that, and I had to fight for it. My government did not pay for it, but my cousins who stayed there, most of them, if they're lucky, they finished a bachelor degree. So within, like, you know, 2 generations, you had, you know, a state that was not interested in its population, like my grandparents who did not have any education, not even a high school education, to my father who had a PhD and a post PhD and who was part of the ministry, to then, you know, my generation, either you left Iraq and, you know, either you were lucky or not lucky, had the support and resources to do something with your life. And if you stayed, either, you know, some of my cousins were tortured and died under Saddam Hussein. Some were died during the Iraqi invasion, the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and some who don't have, you know, a bachelor degree or even high school education, you know. So within 2 generations, you saw a re-engineering of a society that's, you know, my dad, who really believed in the nationalist project, really believed, he left the U.S., went back because he really believed in reconstructing Iraq, to a generation now who are not interested in studying and who are not interested in being part of the state or these institutions because of all the examples we talked about, right? And are really interested in leaving and working in the Gulf and making as much money and being part of this neoliberal project. So again, you know, like Dr. Suheir, this is not just about oil. It's not about just the material and political control. It is really about reconstruction of society. the destruction of collective memory, national identity, and a reconstruction of a society that is looking towards a neoliberal future, and is committed to a neoliberal future. So like Dr. Suheir said, this is, we're talking about generations from now that are going to be moving in that direction unless something else happens. So I just wanted to say that. I'm sorry, there was two other, Dr. Patnick, or Mr. Patnick, I'm sorry, there were two other points that you made that you wanted answers to. I forgot. Would you remind me or remind us of the two questions or clarifications?
No, I was just wondering, what is the mechanism through which private appropriation of the oil revenue takes place? It is corruption, it is bribery, but what exactly is the mechanism of that bribery?
Can you elaborate more? Are you talking conceptual or you want examples? Can you elaborate a little bit more?
No, Professor Suheir talked about just now about private appropriation of oil revenue as an instance of the bribery, which did not exist earlier, but which has been unleashed after the American invasion. So I just wanted to know exactly what is the mechanism. How do people get hold of public money? In other words, what's the mechanism?
Anybody?
Is Dr. Suheir still with us, or is he gone?
I think he's here. Dr. Suheir,
نعم.
do you want to answer the question of Dr. Patnaik?
I already said that. In terms of food and medicine conversation. So that was a way to make sure that Iraq only buys the things that it needs by the approval only of the United States. You cannot buy anything from China. You cannot buy anything from any other entity. Everything has to be approved by US government. So Iraq has no choice. We are led by the dictates of the United States. And so all the oil that we sell goes to the US federal bank. So the current US government receives a list from the Iraqi government, and the US government eventually decides which are the things that could be sent to Iraq. So even the medical, chemical equipment, materials could not be delivered on time, or even as Dena spoke about the lead and pencils, the situation continues as is. And also the medicine that gets, the medicine that gets imported, it's also expired. So we still have a lot of these issues that happened in the 90s still exist. So since the invasion, the situation continued. So since the invasion, this project continued, is being reproduced. The destiny of the money of oil money is still in US federal bank. In terms of revenues, I don't know how to answer it particularly, but the origins of it is to weaken the Iraqi economy. But then the best way to seek an answer for this is by going to the Iraqi Central Bank.
If I may add 3 more examples that I think are very critical, that I think as Iraqis we take for granted because we're so used to it, but I think are so evident. I think the issue of, one example that is, we take for granted because it's been happening for so long that it's become kind of the air we breathe. The issue of electricity, and Dr. Suheir, if you want to elaborate on that, the issue of electricity is still an issue in Iraq. So you have to realize, people who have not gone through an invasion and 40
الكهرباء بتروح بتجي عندي تطفي الكهرباء.
we take for granted, we think it's like, background noise. We don't use that as evidence. But I think people who have not gone through war or an invasion and 14 years of war and have not had consistent electricity for 40 years do not understand what that means. And I think, we don't mention these examples that are so critical to the entire infrastructure. What do I mean by that? Okay, so let me break this down in just 2 examples. You have when it's the crisis moment, when an invasion happens and there's no electricity for a period of time. So let's just imagine it was 2003 and an invasion is happening and you have no electricity for how long? دكتور سهير قد طول بالله الكهرباء لما رجع؟ هو طبعا ما رجع تماما بس اول ما غربوا 2003.
Could you explain a little bit about before 2003, when did we start have power cuts? When all the electricity were manufacturing entities were completely destroyed.
Access to my laptop. I'm talking about people who are using it for life support, whether they need to breathe through, at a hospital, they're on, attached to whatever medical equipment that's, supporting their life. I remember the issue of children in incubators because they all died because there's no electricity. You have to realize so it's not only the moment of crisis, the 2003 invasion where you have the spectacle of war. We have to realize until today, we don't have electricity 24 hours. It's still broken down. We've created a new infrastructure of generators that basically click in when public electricity goes off. That has supported us, but it's still a problem. تفضل دكتور كمل.
إذا سمحت لي. ألو. ممكن أقدم تقرير شامل كافي ووافي.
I can provide a comprehensive report from 2003 on the amount of money that's being spent on the file of electricity. From 2003 to now, you cannot imagine the amount of money that's spent on it. Many companies that came, and there were Chinese companies that came, they wanted to produce electricity companies in Iraq and with excess. All the contracts, and then I can provide this with facts. Iraq right now, if there's any development, it's either supermarket or schools, private schools, or supermarkets, malls. Nothing is productive. All service, all the contracts that the government does or the government signs, they take like 20%, from the total price. They take 20%, the government. And then they give you the contract. They don't care about the quality. They don't care about anything else. They just want to make profit out of these small things. Even roads or anything like that, they don't think about when they make an asphalt road. They don't think of its thickness, of its temperature that's going to be exposed to. So the sidewalks of the roads, they might have fixed it 50 times. So every year they get and they sign new contracts, and then they take 20% off of it, and they have documentations that show the corruption. So any project, it's never fully implemented. Electricity is a massive issue, and I will provide you with a report of all the money that's spent on that file from 2003 until now. And it's a very political issue, this electricity, from 1990s, even during the previous regime, but it is a very political. Because they wanted to obliterate the ability of the state to provide the necessities. And so they wanted to force us by burning us and by the use of heated iron, as we say in Arabic, to torture the whole Iraqi human beings. And we still experience that, but the electricity file is political. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all of you, really. I mean, this has been a very engaging, incredibly valuable, and I hope that all those who have joined us really had a chance to learn about the murderous and criminal impact of, of these measures on the Iraqi people and on the state itself.
One last thing that just came to mind, and I'll stop. I think it's also critical that we didn't mention, just a small detail.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also very important to remember that during the invasion, the 2003 invasion, one of the basic things that did not happen, the borders were not secured. When the United States invaded, all the borders were completely open. I actually, and this is not based on just research, I came from Jordan, flew into Jordan and drove from Jordan to Iraq, because at that time you could not fly to Iraq. And there were no checkpoints at all. There were 2 or maybe 3 American soldiers standing and just telling people to move like this. So borders were completely unsecured. So one of the first things in any invasion, right? If you are, in basic 101 is you secure borders. So again, back to this kind of systematic destruction and systematic understanding of creating chaos in Iraq, right? So, this is part of this attraction of people like ISIS that came into Iraq, and Iraq became the battlefield. I mean, this is a whole different example that I can go into, but I think it's, I can spend a lot of time talking about how even the construction of ISIS in Iraq was orchestrated, right?
That's
The
right. Thank you.
construction of militias in Iraq were orchestrated. The construction of the civil war, and I hate to call it civil war, we need to come up with better terminology, was orchestrated by the United States government. 101, you open borders and you are dealing with an invasion of Iraq. You are basically inviting another Afghanistan to happen. And that's exactly what ended up happening. I can continue, but I know because of time I will stop. But I think that was a key example that was not brought up.
Dena, I honestly hate to have to stop you both. It's not that I want to, but due to time issues, I mean, it's been fantastic to hear all of you talking today. And it's so important that you gave us the opportunity to learn more about the criminality of this. I was, as we were preparing for this hearing, I went back to the words of Colin Powell on the 5th of February, sitting at the UN Security Council. He had the courage to say, my colleagues, every statement I made today is backed up by solid sources. We are providing you with facts and conclusion based on solid intelligence. This is a political class. Today, I think we will really provided with evidence. This is the solid evidence that needs to be provided to the world. And I really want to thank you, all of you, for this. Dena, Suheir, Raed, that unfortunately has left now, and all the jurors have joined us. I really want to thank you for this. It is touching again. It is unnerving to have to go and hear through all this, but there is solidarity. There is people joining us. There is people who want to hear about us. We have to continue to let the word out and fight. There were 15 million people who went out for this, against the invasion, and still they didn't listen to them. But, we have to continue. Thank you so much today for joining, and thank you for all the work that you shared with us. Keep following us on the website as well, sanctionstribunal.org, for the next hearings in the coming weeks. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Best of luck. Thank you for your time.
شكرا جميعا. شكرا دكتور محمد.
شكرا يا
دكتورة دينا. شكرا دكتورة دينا.
شكرا دكتور سهير، دكتور محمد، شكرا للكل. السلام عليكم.